a lot of interesting research in a number of areas, so sacred sites in South America, megalithic stones, and also the elongated skulls. The topic I wanted to ask you about today is the elongated skulls. Is that okay?
Sure.
Oh
yeah, that's fine.
Subject. Okay. So you've done really extensive research into this, and I understand you're also writing a book about the elongated skulls as well at the moment. Could we start with a bit of background, for example, where and how these elongated skulls were found?
Oh, sure. Well, actually, David Hatcher-Childress and I wrote a book, and it was published February of last year. And it's called The Enigma of Cranial Deformation because we were studying the global phenomenon of elongated skulls because they did exist in many different parts of the world. And so we wanted to document that and also see what relationships there were between these different cultures, because the big question is, did this spontaneously show up in different cultures independently, or are there timeline relationships? Did it all originate in one place or in different places? So that was the subject of that book, and now I'm presently working on volume 2, which is more about Peru and Bolivia, because that's where the largest and most numerous elongated skulls are.
Okay, so I've read that they have been found in places like Vanuatu, Malta, Mexico. Is there anything that links these places together? Is there any kind of suggested relationship as to why they would have been found in these different areas?
Well, the thing is that most people would be acquainted with the Egyptian ones, specifically Akhenaten and Nefertiti, but that's one of the reasons I'm going to Egypt, is to physically look at whatever mummies are there that have proposed elongated skulls and see if in fact that is the case, because it showed up in the art of the Amarna period. These sculptures of enormously elongated skulls, but the researchers that I work with, like Stephen Mailer, say that there is no relationship between the actual physical bodies and the art, but the question is, where did it come from? But there seems to be a Middle Eastern origin of some kind, possibly in ancient Iraq during the Sumerian times or prior to that. And for example, the ones that are found in Melanesia, and that was, cranial deformation was done up until quite recently, and according to their oral tradition, they say that they originally came from Egypt. And of course, the people of the Congo, of Western Africa, they also say that their origins come from Egypt. So that's one possibility. But the odd thing is, my main study has been Paracas in Peru, which is on the coast, and south of Lima, and just north of where the famous Nazca lines are. And that's where the largest skulls are found. Genetically, those people who died out 2,000 years ago don't seem to be related to anyone else in Peru. So the question is, where did their bloodline come from? And where did this ceremonial practice come from? And that's what I'm still researching.
Okay, and I understand that one of the key findings is that there are really two main types of elongated skulls: those that have been intentionally formed that way through the practice of head binding, and those that seem to have a more genetic cause. Could you explain a little bit about the evidence for the genetically produced elongated skulls?
Sure. The vast majority are the result of cranial deformation. It's a cultural practice, or was a cultural practice. It was most common about 2,000 years ago. And so the common denominator amongst all of these global cultures was three factors. One, they say that it made their children more attractive looking. They also thought that it enhanced their intelligence. And the most interesting and enigmatic thing is that is what the ancestors supposedly looked like. So again, in Paracas and other places where these existed, you can tell that the children were cradle boarded, or some kind of binding was done to the skull in order to change the shape. But in a few cases, and especially in Peru, what I'm finding after looking at hundreds of these is there are some that appear to be very natural in shape because the cranial deformation is quite obvious. You see a flattening of the forehead and a flattening of the back of the skull. So it's easy to tell that some kind of hard substance like wood or whatever was used and then wrapped in order to gradually compress the skull to alter its shape. But in the case of Peru, the cranial volume seems to be larger, and there are a few cases where the shape of the skull is so complicated that you couldn't simply bind the skull to change the shape, and you definitely can't increase the volume. So those are the ones that I'm particularly interested in, and I have, through other people, had samples of molar teeth sent to a DNA laboratory in Texas. And what they're doing is they're in the process of extracting the DNA right now. And it'll be quite a long process of having them analyzed because since this genetic material is at least 2,000 years old, it will have broken down to some degree. So we need the latest equipment of DNA analysis to try to piece together the broken strands of DNA.
Okay. And as far as you know, have any babies, the skulls of babies been found with elongated skulls? Because presumably this would also prove a genetic factor in the sense that a child is actually born with an elongated skull as opposed to going through this process of head binding, which I understand takes a few years before it makes the change to the skull.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There is one in the Little Paracas Museum, which I'm the assistant director of, and it still is. It's a mummified baby skull, and it's still wrapped in its traditional clothing. So, the museum director, unfortunately, has not allowed me to remove the textile in order to be able to look at the shape of the skull because. Technically, it belongs to the Peruvian government, and so that will be an incredibly long, pile of paper in order to get anything done. But there is a very intriguing skeleton, which is in a little museum outside of Cusco, and the town is called Andahuaylilas, and this baby confounds all of the experts that I've taken there, including doctors and dentists, because it appears that the child is about 18 months old, because the fontanella, which is on the top of the head, that's where the plates come together. It's not completely fused. And so conventionally, the child would be thought of as being about 18 months. But the teeth are that of a 7 or 8-year-old child. And also the head or skull is about the same size as the torso. So every medical professional I've taken there are completely dumbfounded. So that is possibly the most intriguing example that does exist presently.
And there are no sort of diseases or genetic mutations that could account for something like this that you know of?
Not that I know of. There are different diseases that could alter the shape of the growing skull. The most obvious one is hydrocephaly, which is water on the brain. But that produces a total effect of almost creating a beach ball or rounded shape. It doesn't. This one is very much like a cone head. So the doctors that I've taken there to look at it, again, the really interesting thing is that obviously a doctor goes through very specific training for a number of years. They have, they deeply study anatomy, but what they're always taught about in general is what a normal human being looks like. So when they see this, you can tell the way their mind is working, that they're going through standard procedure in terms of what they've been taught, and this doesn't fit within that box. And so, again, so far, no doctor has been able to explain especially the Andahuaylilas baby away as being some kind of having a genetic problem or some kind of childhood disease. It's outside of the parameters of their comprehension.
Okay. And one of the things you've mentioned is that there are 5 distinct skull shapes that have been found. Do they differ only according to the shape, or do they also have other features that differentiate them?
Yeah, there are basically five different shapes, and especially in the area, again, of Paracas. You can tell different styles of cranial deformation were performed. Everything from basically the compression of the skull to elongation horizontally to elongation vertically. But it's the ones that are vertical which show the possible examples of having been born with that condition, whatever that condition is.
All right, so four of them seem to be intentionally created to be like that, and there's one type which could be the genetic
Yeah,
type.
yeah, basically, because the thing is that with cranial deformation, since you're altering the shape of the skull over the course of, on average, about 3 years, and because it's quite a primitive binding technique, unless the practitioner is an absolute expert, you're not going to have perfect bilateral symmetry. You'll get, the skulls have a tendency to shift from one side to the other based on how the binding was done, and the same with the compression. But in the few cases that seem to be natural, they are, at least visually, perfectly bilaterally symmetrical.
Okay. And regarding the DNA testing, which is underway at the moment, do you have any predictions about what they might find with this testing process?
Well, it's a very complex process because it isn't simply. There are other aspects that are also being studied. One of them is the fact that in all cases around the world, the deformation was only done to the royal class of a society. So it was only the royal children this was done to. And again, supposedly because this is what the ancestors looked like. In the case of the Paracas, almost all of these royal people and children have reddish brown hair. And so that's being studied as we speak, actually, in California right now, through electromagnetic testing and other tests to see if the hair has been dyed or if it's naturally reddish brown.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does turn out that it's naturally reddish brown, then that probably means that some part of that ancestry is not North American native, because North American native people have a very strong tendency of having very black hair, brown skin, and brown eyes. So if this hair turns out to be this reddish brown, then that suggests that there was genetic input from some other part of the planet.
And if the DNA testing does produce an unusual result, and I suppose by unusual I mean it comes out saying that this DNA is not human or not recognized according to what science currently knows, do you think the scientific community would take this result seriously and put some attention to this, or do you think it would be pushed to the side for obvious reasons?
Well, that is why I have one of the best labs in the world working on it. Because obviously if you just take samples to a genetic lab and have it tested, academics and scholars will definitely question everything about it. So what we want to have done is we want to have these tests performed and then future tests as well by different laboratories, so to make sure that the results are, that there's a continuity in the results. Everything is going to go through a series of tests. The first test is quite simple, and that is simply to see, obviously, if it's human DNA. And then once the first tests are done, the samples will be sent to the global genetic database, and what they can tell is not only is it human, but more specifically where the ancestry comes from. And that's what intrigues me most. So if it turns out that the DNA is purely human, then that is what we have. However, there is the possibility that there will be segments of DNA which don't match modern humans, may not even match ancient humans, and if they don't match anything involved in humanity whatsoever, then there will be a comparison with other of the hominid-like beings like apes and monkeys, etc. and then it's a backwards process from there. It is maybe possible that if there are segments of DNA that don't match anything in the global database, that we're looking at something which we can't explain from a terrestrial point of view.
So the testing is quite a big process by the sounds of things. When are the results actually expected to come out, or at least the first stage of results?
Well, the important thing is that I've had samples sent by other people to other labs in the U.S. There were hair samples and skin samples, but they aren't the best because there is the great possibility of there being contamination from bacteria, from people, from the people taking the samples coming in contact, and that would contaminate. And so the best samples come from the core of molar teeth, and so that's where the latest samples came from. They are presently the DNA has been extracted from the teeth as far as I know, and depending upon funding, it'll be a process of going through probably at least a few months of work before we'll get the initial results, telling us, whether they're basically purely human or not. And then over the course of many months, then we're expecting more and more detailed data to come from that.
And if people did want to, people interested in this subject did want to contribute to that funding of this great process of testing, how would they do that?
At this point, we're not really fundraising because we have raised sufficient funds for the first level of testing to be completed. And so I don't want to have people contribute any money until we have something solid and scientific as a benchmark to go from. Once we have the initial data, if it continues to be an intriguing thing, then there will be a call for contributions. What we definitely do want is we want individual contributions. We don't want institutions or large entities to get involved, because then you get into the chaotic thing about who controls the data, etc.
Different agendas.
Yeah, so it's we want it to be a ground-based thing with many small contributions from as many people as possible, so that we can, that spreads the whole thing out, so that nobody can say, well, I contributed 51%, so I get control. We want it to be, nice and simple in that kind of way.
Okay. And for people that want to follow this research and stay up to date with the information as it comes out, with the results, how would they do that? How would they stay up to date with what's happening in this field?
Well, the best thing is probably to follow my website, which is www.hiddenincatours.com.
And you send out notifications on there with latest news?
Yeah, definitely, but even more so on Facebook. I'm Brien Foerster on Facebook, and I post things not only of the skulls, but also of the megalithic structures of Peru and Bolivia, and globally now, because thankfully through Facebook I get a lot of contributions from people around the world, including Greece, etc., sending me photographs of things which don't fit with the conventional archaeological story.
Okay, great. Well, let's finish it up there. I think there's a lot of interesting material that you've contributed there, so I think people will be really interested to hear what you've had to say on the topic.
Okay, thank you very much.